You need to stay 500 feet away from the premises. You have been served. A man in a cheap suit shoved a stack of legal papers into my chest before I could even reach the church doors. I looked down at the document. Ex parte, restraining order. Reason: elder abuse. My stepmother, Cynthia, stood at the top of the stairs in a black veil that cost more than my car. She didn't look sad. She looked like she had won. She had actually hired private security to ban me from my own father's funeral based on a complete lie. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just looked the guard in the eye. Make sure she spells my name right on the police report. Then I turned around and walked away. Before I tell you what she was actually hiding inside that church, drop a comment and let me know. What is the most unforgivable thing a family member has ever done to you at a funeral? I am reading every single one. 20 minutes later, I wasn't sitting in a pew praying for my father's soul. I was sitting in a leather chair in a high-rise office, placing the restraining order on a mahogany desk. Across from me sat Mr. Vance, my father's corporate attorney. He wasn't the family lawyer. He was the man Dad called when business got ugly. He picked up the document, read the accusations of abuse, and sighed. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired. He asked if I wanted water. I told him I wanted the truth. Cynthia didn't ban me because she hated me. Hate is an emotion. And Cynthia doesn't operate on emotion. She operates on leverage. Banning me from the funeral was a tactical necessity. Mr. Vance turned his monitor so I could see the spreadsheet. It was a loan application. A hard money loan against my father's construction company. For those who don't know, a hard money loan is what you get when no reputable bank will touch you. The interest rates are predatory. The terms are lethal. But the cash is fast. Cynthia was trying to borrow $500,000 against the company's assets, and the closing was scheduled for 2 o'clock this afternoon. That explained the timeline. To close that loan, she needed to sign an affidavit of heirship, a legal document swearing under penalty of perjury that she was the sole heir to the estate. If I was at the funeral, if I was in the room, the lenders might ask questions. They might ask the daughter standing right there if she had a claim. By legally barring me from the premises with a restraining order, she ensured she was the only voice in the room. Mr. Vance looked at me with pity. He told me I should probably just let it go, that fighting her would be messy. He forgot who he was talking to. I'm 29 years old, and I don't work in marketing or sales. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my days auditing failing corporations and tracking assets for federal indictments. I look at spreadsheets the way other people look at crime scenes. I see the blood trails and the numbers. I looked at the loan documents again. The interest rate was 18%. The default penalty was immediate liquidation. It was financial suicide. Why would she do this? Why risk prison for $500,000 when the estate was worth millions? That was when the math clicked. This is what economists call the sunk cost of evil. Most people think villains commit crimes because they are greedy. But in my line of work, I've learned that's rarely true. They commit crimes because they are drowning. Cynthia wasn't trying to get rich. She was trying to stay afloat. She and my siblings, Brandon and Ashley, had been living on credit for years, banking on Dad's money to bail them out. They had spent the inheritance before Dad was even cold. They had sunk so much cost into their lifestyle, the leased cars, the country club memberships, the appearances, that they couldn't afford to be moral. Being a good person would mean bankruptcy. So, they doubled down. They forged a will, banned a daughter, and were about to defraud a lender because the alternative was admitting they were destitute. I looked at Mr. Vance. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt the cold, familiar clarity of an audit beginning. I told him we weren't going to stop the loan. We were going to let her sign it. He asked if I was crazy. I told him I was just thorough. If we stopped her now, it was a family dispute. But the moment her pen left the paper on that affidavit, it became bank fraud. And unlike family disputes, bank fraud comes with mandatory sentencing guidelines. I stood up. I told him to grab his coat. We had a closing to attend. Mr. Vance slid the forged will across the mahogany desk. It was a masterpiece of fiction. According to this document, dated 3 weeks ago, my father had lucidly and lovingly bequeathed his entire estate, the construction company, the house, the investment accounts, to his devoted wife, Cynthia. I looked at the signature at the bottom of page 4. It was beautiful. A sweeping, confident, Thomas J. Sterling, in black ink. It was the signature of a man in his prime. It was also a physical impossibility. I closed my eyes for a second, and the smell of antiseptic and stale coffee filled my nose. I was back in the guest room I'd converted into a hospice ward 6 months ago. I remembered the sound of the IV pump beeping at 3 a.m. I remembered draining my savings account, $185,000, to pay for the experimental immunotherapy that insurance rejected and Cynthia called a waste of resources on a dying man. She hadn't visited him once in those final weeks. She was too busy protecting her energy at a spa in Sedona. She didn't see the reality of his decline. I opened my eyes and tapped the signature on the desk. "This is a tracing," I said, my voice flat. "Probably from a deed he signed in the 90s. Vance frowned, putting on his reading glasses. "It looks authentic, Jocelyn. A handwriting expert might argue it's just a good day for him." "Dad didn't have good days," I corrected him. "He had late-stage Parkinson's. For the last 2 months, he couldn't hold a spoon, let alone a fountain pen. His hand tremors were so severe I had to feed him through a straw." I pulled a file from my bag. It wasn't a legal brief. It was a medical log. "This is his neurologist's report from 3 days before this will was allegedly signed. Patient exhibits severe resting tremor and rigidity, unable to perform fine motor tasks." If he had actually signed this will, the ink would be a jagged mess. "This signature is steady. It's perfect. And that perfection is going to send her to prison." Vance looked at the medical report, then back at the will. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "This proves forgery. We can file an emergency injunction right now. We can stop the loan closing before it starts." He reached for his phone. I put my hand over his. Vance froze. "Jocelyn, if she closes that loan, she encumbers the company. It complicates everything. If we stop her now," I said, leaning forward, "it's just a civil dispute. She'll claim she found the will in a drawer and didn't know it was fake. She'll play the confused, grieving widow. A judge might slap her on the wrist and invalidate the document. She walks away free." I looked at the clock on the wall. 1 hour until the closing. But if she walks into that bank and signs the affidavit of heirship, if she uses this forged document to secure a $500,000 loan, that is bank fraud. That is wire fraud. That is a federal felony with a mandatory minimum sentence. I stood up and smoothed my skirt. I didn't want a victory that involved months of mediation. I wanted a total knockout. "We aren't going to stop her, Mr. Vance. We're going to hold the door open for her." I sat in the passenger seat of Mr. Vance's car, parked 2 blocks away from the private equity firm where the closing was taking place. The engine was off. The air conditioning was cooling rapidly. I checked my watch. The funeral service had ended 45 minutes ago. They would be in the limo now, heading toward their payday. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from Instagram. I tapped the screen. My half-sister's face filled the frame, filtered to perfection. A single, artful tear glistening on her cheek. She was in the back of a stretch limousine. Behind her, I could see the minibar stocked with champagne. "Hey, beautiful souls," she whispered, voice cracking theatrically. "Today was the hardest day of my life. Saying goodbye to Daddy. It just breaks you open. But I know he'd want us to keep building his legacy. He'd want us to be strong." She raised a hand to wipe the tear, and the sunlight caught the brooch pinned to her black dress. It was a vintage diamond cluster in the shape of a dove. My breath hitched. That wasn't just jewelry. That was my grandmother's mourning pin. She had worn it to my grandfather's funeral. She had pinned it to my coat when I graduated college. Dad had kept it in his safe deposit box, specifically designated for me in the original estate plan. Ashley hadn't just inherited it. She had raided the safe before the body was even cold. She was wearing stolen property as a prop for her grief performance. Comments were rolling in on the side of the screen. "So strong, Ash. He left the empire in good hands, sending light and love." I didn't feel sad. I felt the cold, sharp click of a lock engaging. They weren't mourning him. They were looting him. They were picking the gold fillings out of a corpse. Another notification popped up. A text message from my stepbrother, Brandon. "Don't even think about showing up at the house later. We have security. Dad hated you, Jocelyn. He told us everything. Just accept that you're out, and move on, before I have you arrested for trespassing." I read the text twice. Brandon, the entrepreneur who had burned through 3 startups funded by Dad's retirement accounts. Brandon, who had threatened to beat me up when I refused to sign a loan guarantee for his crypto mining rig last year. He was feeling bold now. He thought he was the new patriarch. He thought he was holding the keys to the kingdom. He had no idea he was standing on a trapdoor. I took a screenshot of the text. I screen recorded Ashley's video, zooming in on the stolen brooch. I saved everything to a cloud folder named Evidence. Final. Mr. Vance looked over at me. "You okay?" "They're drinking champagne in the limo," I said, putting my phone away. "Ashley is wearing my grandmother's brooch. And Brandon just threatened to arrest me." Vance gripped the steering wheel. "We can add theft to the list of charges later. Right now, we need to focus on the bank." "I'm focused," I said. "I'm just appreciating the irony." "Which part?" "They think they're driving to a celebration," I said, checking my watch again. 1:55. "They don't realize they're driving to a crime scene." I opened the car door. The heat of the afternoon pavement hit me, but I didn't feel it. I felt cold. I felt precise. Let's go, I said. I don't want to be late for the signing. We rode the elevator up to the 40th floor in silence. The private equity firm, Apex Capital, occupied the entire penthouse level. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city I had grown up in, the city my father had helped build, and the city his wife was currently trying to sell off for parts. Mr. Vance adjusted his tie. I tightened my grip on the file folder. We walked past the reception desk. The receptionist tried to stop us. Excuse me. Do you have an appointment? Mr. Vance is legal counsel for the deceased, I said, not breaking stride. And I'm the executioner. I pushed open the double glass doors to the boardroom. The air conditioning hit me first, a wall of sterile, expensive cold. Inside, seated around a table that cost more than most people's annual salary, was the unholy trinity. Cynthia, Brandon, and Ashley. They looked up, startled. Cynthia was in the middle of signing a document. Her pen hovered over the paper. The lender, a slick man in a tailored suit, looked annoyed at the interruption. What is the meaning of this? Cynthia demanded, her voice shrill. Get out! I have a restraining order. She stood up, pointing a manicured finger at me. Security! Call security! I didn't yell. I didn't engage. I walked to the head of the table, right next to the lender, and placed the forensic report on the glass surface. My name is Jocelyn Sterling, I said to the lender, ignoring Cynthia completely. I am a forensic accountant. And before you disperse $500,000, there is something you need to see. Cynthia lunged for the folder. Don't listen to her. She's crazy. She was abusive to my husband. Mr. Vance stepped in front of her, blocking her path. Sit down, Cynthia. Or I will call the district attorney myself. The lender looked from me to Cynthia, then picked up the file. He opened it. The first page was the handwriting analysis. The second was the neurologist's report. The signature on the will you are using as collateral is a forgery, I said. My voice calm. Factual. Boring. My father had advanced Parkinson's. He physically could not sign his name. That signature is a tracing. Cynthia's face went white. That's a lie. He signed it. He had a good day. He didn't have good days, I continued, speaking only to the lender. But even if he did, there is another problem with your collateral. I slid a second document across the table. It was the forensic audit report I had compiled over the last 48 hours. You checked the company's credit report, which is clean, but you didn't check the internal ledgers. My father hasn't paid payroll taxes in 3 years to keep the company afloat. The IRS has a silent lien that supersedes your loan. The business has $14.5 million in debt. If you fund this loan, the government takes your money first. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the server room down the hall. The lender looked at the audit report. He looked at the tax liens. He looked at Cynthia. Then he slowly closed the file and pushed it away. Is this true? He asked Cynthia. No. I didn't know. Thomas handled the finances, she stammered. By signing that affidavit of heirship, I said, pointing to the paper she had just signed. But the lender hadn't yet countersigned. You claimed sole ownership of the business. You just claimed sole liability for $14 million in federal debt. Cynthia stared at the paper. Her hands started to shake. But there's money, she whispered. The insurance. The life insurance. I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just closed the trap. Actually, I said, pulling out the final document. The life insurance policy $2 million was designated payable on death. It bypasses the will. It bypasses probate. And the beneficiary isn't the estate. I held up the policy document. The beneficiary name was highlighted in yellow. Jocelyn Marie Sterling. The business is yours, Cynthia, I said. And the debt. I'll take the cash. Cynthia looked at me. She looked at the lender, who was now packing up his briefcase. She looked at her children, who were staring at her with dawning horror. The reality of what she had done crashed down on her. She hadn't just lost. She had legally shackled herself to a sinking ship. Then, her eyes rolled back in her head. She clutched her chest and let out a strangled cry. My heart, she screamed, collapsing onto the carpet. She's killing me. Brandon dropped to his knees instantly. Mom! Mom! He looked up at me, his face twisted in ugly performative panic. You did this. You killed Dad, and now you're killing her. Are you happy now? Ashley stood frozen, her phone still in her hand, but for once, she wasn't recording. She looked terrified. The lender was already on his feet, shouting into his cell phone. We need an ambulance at Apex Capital. 40th floor. Possible heart attack. Cynthia was writhing on the expensive carpet, clutching her left arm with a grip that turned her knuckles white. My pacemaker, she wheezed, her voice a ragged gasp. Card. In my purse. Brandon scrambled for her Hermes bag, dumping the contents onto the floor. Lipstick, a breath mint, and a laminated red card. He shoved it toward the lender. She has a heart condition. This stress is lethal for her. It was a brilliant performance. Truly. If I hadn't spent the last 48 hours dissecting her life, I might have believed it. But I knew Cynthia. I knew she didn't have a pacemaker. She had a theatrical flair and a desperate need to control the narrative. The double doors burst open. 2 paramedics rushed in, carrying a trauma bag and a portable defibrillator. 2 police officers followed close behind, their hands resting on their belts. The lender pointed a shaking finger at Cynthia. That's the woman. She just attempted to sign a fraudulent loan document. The lead paramedic knelt beside Cynthia. Ma'am. Can you hear me? Where is the pain? Chest. Cynthia moaned, her eyes fluttering. Crushing. Can't breathe. One of the officers stepped forward with handcuffs, but the paramedic waved him off. Back off. She's in cardiac distress. We need to transport her immediately. Brandon looked at me with a sneer of triumph. You see? You can't touch her. She's sick. This was the false ending. This was the moment the villain escapes in an ambulance, buying herself 3 days in a private hospital room to transfer funds offshore, destroy the hard drives, and lawyer up before the police can touch her. She was weaponizing the healthcare system to evade justice. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I didn't feed the chaos. I simply walked over to the lead paramedic. Sir, I said, my voice low and steady. Before you load her up, you need to see this. I opened the file folder I'd been holding. It wasn't the forensic audit. It was the medical history I'd pulled from Dad's insurance records she was on as a dependent. This patient has a documented history of acute cardiac events that coincide exactly with 3 civil court dates, an IRS audit in 2019, and a deposition last year. I said, handing him the papers. Here are the ER discharge summaries. Clean EKGs. Normal troponin levels, every single time. The paramedic paused. He looked at the charts. He looked at the EKG monitor he had just hooked up to Cynthia's chest. I suggest you check her enzymes right here, I continued. Because she is currently a suspect in a multi-million-dollar felony bank fraud, and she is a flight risk. If she leaves this room, it should be in custody. Cynthia's moans stopped abruptly. Her eyes snapped open. She looked at the paramedic, then at the police officer, and finally at me. The mask didn't just slip. It shattered. There was no pain in her face. There was only the cold, hard hatred of a predator who realizes the cage door has shut. The paramedic watched the monitor. Sinus rhythm, he announced flatly. Vitals are stable. Oxygen saturation is 99%. He stood up and began packing his bag. She's medically cleared for transport, officer. But she doesn't need an ambulance. The police officer stepped forward. Cynthia Sterling, please stand up. You are under arrest for bank fraud, wire fraud, and forgery. No, Brandon shouted, stepping between them. She's my mother. You can't. Step aside, son, the officer said, his hand dropping to his taser. Unless you want to join her as an accessory. Cynthia stood up. She smoothed her skirt with trembling hands. She didn't look at her children. She looked at me. You ungrateful little witch, she hissed. I should have left you in the street when I found you. You tried, I said. But you missed. They handcuffed her. They marched her out past the stunned receptionist. Brandon and Ashley trailed behind, looking like lost children who had just realized the ATM was out of order. Mr. Vance stood beside me, watching the elevator doors close. He let out a long breath. That, he said, was the most brutal thing I have ever seen. It wasn't brutal, Mr. Vance, I said, closing my file. It was just an audit. And the books are finally balanced. 3 weeks later, I parked my car at the end of the marina pier where Dad used to take me fishing on Sundays. The engine ticked into silence. The ocean air smelled like salt and diesel, the smell of my childhood. I looked down at the passenger seat. There was a cashier's check sitting there. $2 million. The life insurance payout. It was clean money. Unencumbered. Mine. Across town, the landscape looked very different. Cynthia wasn't living in a garden shed, but it was close enough. She was out on bail, awaiting trial for bank fraud, wire fraud, and identity theft. She was living in a studio apartment above a laundromat, wearing an ankle monitor instead of diamonds. The hard money lenders didn't wait for probate. When the loan application flagged for fraud and the business solvency collapsed, they exercised their liens. The mansion was seized yesterday. Brandon and Ashley weren't faring much better. Because they were listed as officers on the fraudulent loan application, their credit scores had been nuked. Brandon was parking cars as a valet at the very country club he used to belong to. Ashley was selling her authentic lifestyle piece by piece on resale apps just to pay rent. They had gambled everything on a single signature. And they had lost. I picked up my phone and opened the spreadsheet I had looked at every single day for the last 6 months. Dad, medical, costs, tracking. It was a grid of red numbers, debt, and sleepless nights. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I felt light. I selected the file. I hit delete. The screen cleared. The debt was gone. The burden was gone. My father used to say that family is the people who stay when the money runs out. By that definition, he died with exactly one family member, and I was going to make sure his legacy was spent on things that actually mattered, starting with a donation to the Parkinson's Foundation in his name, and then a very long vacation. They wanted to erase me from the family. I just obliged them. If you believe family isn't about blood, but about loyalty, hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone who needs to know that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting the trash take itself out.